Rosalind Mercer picked up the chamber pot from beside the bed, walked out the front door of the farmhouse in her nightgown, and hurled it into the yard with both hands. It hit the frozen ground and shattered. She stood on that sagging porch in the gray dawn air, chest heaving, and stared at the broken fence and the empty barn and the dirt that stretched in every direction, like a promise someone had already broken, and she said out loud to no one, "This is not my life." But it was, every last miserable inch of it. If this story already has you holding your breath, you stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Rosalind's story all the way to the end, because I promise you what she finds on the other side of that ridge is going to change everything you think you know about this woman. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started and what Rosalind did about it. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Rosalind had been sitting at the table in her boarding house room when her landlady slid it under the door without knocking, the way she did with everything. Bills notices the occasional piece of mail that found its way to a woman the world had largely stopped expecting much from. Rosalind picked it up off the floor, turned it over, and saw no return address. Just her name written in a hand that was economical and precise. Not the handwriting of a man trying to impress anyone. The handwriting of a man who wrote what he meant and stopped. She read it once. Then she read it again. A marriage proposal. From a rancher in the Black Hollow territory named Wesley Hawthorne. He described himself plainly a man with land, a man who worked it, a man who had decided he needed a wife of good character more than he needed one of good reputation. He made no promises beyond honest work and honest living. He said he had heard of her situation through a mutual acquaintance. He said he would cover every cost of the journey west. He said, and this was the line she read 3 times, "I am not looking for a woman who is perfect. I am looking for a woman who is capable and who will not be frightened away by difficulty." Rosalind set the letter down. She looked around her room. One window, one chair, a bed frame that squeaked, wallpaper peeling at every corner, a crack in the plaster above the door that her landlady had promised to fix 8 months ago and had not. She was 27 years old, with a full, soft figure that the world had spent most of her life treating as a failing, and a mind sharp enough to have noticed long ago that the people loudest about her appearance were rarely worth half her attention. She had warm brown eyes and thick dark hair and a capacity for hard work that had never once been rewarded with anything resembling fairness. She had also in recent years developed a very clear understanding of what her options were. She picked up the letter and read it one more time. Then she got up, found her writing paper, and began her reply. 6 weeks later, she stepped off a train at the nearest station to Black Hollow, with one trunk, one carpet bag, and the specific kind of nerve that belongs to a woman who has made a decision. She knows is probably foolish and has decided to make it anyway because every other door has already shut. The man waiting with a wagon was not Wesley Hawthorne, who was old and gray-mustached and introduced himself as Earl and communicated primarily through silence. He loaded her trunk without comment and clicked his tongue at the horses, and that was the extent of their introduction. "How far is the ranch?" Rosalind asked once they'd been moving long enough that the silence felt deliberate. "Farmhouse," Earl said. She turned to look at him. "I beg your pardon. Mr. Hawthorne calls it a farmhouse." "All right. How far is the farmhouse?" "Another hour." She faced forward and watched the land unspool around them, flat scrubland rising toward dry hills. The sky enormous overhead, the kind of country that gave a person too much room to think. She used the hour well. She organized internally what she expected to find. A working farmhouse, modest but functional. A man who was straightforward and perhaps rough-mannered. A life that would require adjustment. What she found was different from all of that. The farmhouse that came into view at the end of that hour was barely holding itself together. The front fence was missing a third of its posts. The barn roof sagged on one side as though something heavy had been set on it and never removed. The porch listed. The shutters hung crooked. The whole structure had the look of a place that had been told many times that no one was coming to help it and had started to believe it. Standing in front of it was a man, was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark eyes that fixed on the approaching wagon and stayed there. His coat was dusty and mended at one elbow. His boots were cracked at the toe. His hat was worn low. He was not what the word rancher had assembled in Rosalind's mind on the long journey west. He looked like a man who had been arguing with the land for years and had not yet decided who was winning. He walked toward the wagon when it stopped, and he took off his hat. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Wesley Hawthorne. I'm glad you made it." "Mr. Hawthorne." She took his offered hand and shook it. His grip was firm and brief. "Thank you for sending someone." "Earl's reliable." He glanced at her trunk. "You travel light." "I brought what I thought I'd need." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way men in town had looked at her cataloging and appraising, but the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. Then he nodded and turned toward the house. "I'll show you inside." The inside was clean. That was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered. The floor was swept to bare wood. The dry sink was scrubbed. The few items on the shelf, a lamp, a tin cup, a Bible, a small wooden box, a photograph in a plain frame were arranged with care. A man who lived in genuine defeat did not sweep his floors. He did not arrange his shelf. Rosalind filed that observation away without comment. "The bedroom's through there." Wesley nodded toward the left door. "I'll sleep in the barn until you've settled." "That isn't necessary." "It is," he said. No explanation, no apology. He left. She stood in the middle of that small room and did not allow herself the luxury of despair. She had spent the entire train journey deciding she would not cry when she arrived, no matter what she found, and she was a woman who honored her own decisions. She unpacked her trunk. She put water on the stove. She found the broom in the corner and swept a floor that was already swept because the movement helped her think. What she was thinking was this: the man who had written that letter was not stupid. The letter was not the letter of a stupid man, or a careless one, or one who had built nothing in his life worth keeping. So why did everything around her look like nothing had been built at all? She did not have an answer yet, but she had decided before she finished sweeping that she was going to find one. She slept that first night in a narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and she lay awake a long time listening. Wind through the wall gaps, horses shifting in the barn, and somewhere outside, well past the hour, when a tired man should have been resting, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving back and forth across the yard. She thought, what is he checking in the dark that can't wait until morning? She filed that away too. Morning came gray and sharp with cold, and Rosalind had coffee on the stove and the table set before Wesley came through the door. He stopped just past the threshold when the smell hit him, and for one unguarded moment, his expression did something she hadn't seen yet. Something open and briefly surprised, as though he had prepared himself for many possibilities, and this particular one had not made the list. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She set a cup on the table. "Sit down, Mr. Hawthorne. I'd like to know what needs doing today." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her across the narrow table with those measuring eyes. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You're the second person to say something like that to me in the last 12 hours, Rosalind said. "What did you expect? Someone more easily discouraged?" "I've had considerable practice at not being discouraged." She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Hawthorne, I want to be useful here. I don't know what I've come to yet, but I am capable of learning fast, and I am not going to pretend I don't notice things. So I'd rather we speak plainly from the beginning." He looked at her steadily over the cup. "What things have you noticed?" "Your horses are in better condition than your fences." He said nothing. "Your floor was swept before I swept it. Your shelf is ordered. Your rifle by the door is cleaned and maintained. A man who owns nothing worth protecting does not maintain his rifle that carefully." A long silence. Then, "What else?" "You walked the perimeter of this property last night for 2 hours in the dark. I could hear you from the bedroom." She held his gaze. "That's not the behavior of a man who owns nothing. That's the behavior of a man who owns something he's afraid someone is going to take." Wesley Hawthorne set down his cup. He looked at her with an expression she would learn to recognize over the coming weeks. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The look of a man adjusting his estimation of a situation he thought he had already measured correctly. "You're right," he said. "On all of it." "Then I'd like to understand what I've actually come to, when you're ready to tell me." He picked his cup back up. "Not yet," he said, "but soon." It was not the answer she wanted. But it was an honest one, and she had learned long ago that an honest, incomplete answer was worth more than a complete, comfortable lie. She nodded once and asked him about the fence that needed posts, and he told her, and they talked about work until the coffee was gone, and that was how their marriage began. The town of Black Hollow introduced itself to Rosalind the following Saturday. She had asked to go in with Wesley for supplies because she wanted to see what they were dealing with what the social landscape looked like, who the significant people were, how Wesley moved among them. She understood instinctively that a town told you everything you needed to know about a person if you watched how it reacted to them. What Black Hollow showed her was deliberate cruelty wearing the costume of amusement. The eyes came first, before the wagon had fully stopped, faces turning on the wooden sidewalks, conversations pausing, the particular stillness of a community that has a shared understanding about someone and is pleased to have an audience for its display of that understanding. "Lord have mercy," a man said loudly from outside the feed store. "Is that Hawthorne's mail order?" A woman in a blue dress with a perfectly cinched waist touched her companion's arm and said something that included the word desperate, and both of them laughed in the bright, carrying way of people who want to be heard. Rosalind kept her chin level. She had been performing this particular composure since she was 14 years old. She was exceptionally good at it. Wesley said nothing. But as they stepped up onto the sidewalk toward the general store, his hand moved once to the small of her back. Brief, deliberate, a single touch that said nothing and everything, and then dropped away. Inside the general store, a round-faced man named Decker greeted Wesley with the false warmth of a man who wanted something. "Mr. Hawthorne heard you brought home a bride." He looked at Rosalind with the evaluating eye of someone pricing livestock. "This her?" "This is my wife," Wesley said. "Mrs. Hawthorne." "Well now," Decker smiled at Rosalind. "Welcome to Black Hollow, Mrs. Hawthorne. Settling in all right out there on that?" He slid a glance at Wesley. "Farm." "We're managing very well," Rosalind said. "Thank you for your concern." She said it the way a woman says something pleasant that is also the end of a conversation. Decker blinked, smiled uncertainly, and moved to fill their order. It was outside loading the wagon that Garrett Voss appeared. She heard the change in the street before she saw him. A slight shift in the ambient noise of the town. Conversations resuming too quickly, people finding reasons to look elsewhere. Then a man came across the street with the unhurried walk of someone accustomed to everyone waiting for him, and Rosalind understood immediately who this was before anyone said his name. How was well-dressed, clean coat, polished boots, a hat with no trail dust on it whatsoever. His face was pleasant in the particular way of a man who has trained it to be. He stopped at the side of the wagon and looked at Wesley, the way a man looks at something inconveniently positioned between him and where he wants to go. "Hawthorne," he said. "Voss." Wesley did not look up from the supplies he was loading. "Didn't know you were in town." Voss's eyes moved to Rosalind with a slow, thorough appraisal that was designed to make her feel measured and found wanting. "This the bride I've been hearing about?" "This is my wife," Wesley said, and this time the words were different, flat and final, the way a board sounds when it's nailed down with full force. Voss smiled. He had practiced that smile for a long time, and it showed. "Charming. I do hope you're finding the accommodations acceptable, Mrs. Hawthorne. I imagine a woman accustomed to certain comforts might find it." He paused, affecting consideration. "Challenging living on a stretch of dried-up hardpan with a man who can't keep his fences standing." Rosalind looked at him directly. "I find it suits me," she said. "But then I've always found that the people most concerned with other people's property are the ones least satisfied with their own." A beat of silence. Something moved behind Voss's eyes, quick, cold, and quickly covered by the smile again. "Clever woman," he said. Hawthorne, when you're ready to be reasonable about that land, you know where to find me." He touched the brim of his hat toward Rosalind. "Ma'am." He walked away. Wesley finished loading the wagon. His jaw was set. Rosalind climbed up to the seat and waited until they were moving before she spoke. "He's been trying to buy your land," she said. It wasn't a question. 6 years. "And he hasn't managed it." "No." She watched the town fall away behind them. "What is it about that land, Wesley? What does he actually want?" Wesley's hands tightened once on the reins. "More than he knows how to name," he said. "But you know." He didn't answer. She let it sit. She was learning when to push and when to wait, and this was a moment for waiting. But she filed the question away with everything else she'd been collecting, and she turned it over in her mind all the way back to the farmhouse. The following Wednesday, she stopped waiting. She had been reading the land for 3 weeks by then, not passively, but actively, the way she read everything with the specific attention of someone who knows that the information she needs is already present in the room if she looks in the right place. She had walked the full perimeter of the visible property, twice ostensibly helping Wesley with the fence posts, actually measuring the shape of what she could see against the shape of what the terrain suggested should be there. The ridge to the north bothered her. There was no reason for a ridge that size to be there if there was nothing behind it. The way Wesley looked at it sometimes, not often, not obviously, but occasionally in the late afternoon, when he thought she was busy with other things, was the look of a man looking at something he owned. She had also noticed the floor. Not the way it sounded when you walked on it. She'd lived in enough old buildings to know the way old wood moved, but the way it looked. There was one section near the dry sink where the boards were ever so slightly darker, in a rectangular shape, as though they had been lifted and replaced enough times that the dust pattern had never quite reassembled correctly. On Wednesday evening, when Wesley went to the barn to check on a horse that had been favoring its left foreleg, Rosalind walked to the dry sink, knelt down, and pressed her hand flat against the floor. She was looking for it. She found it. A hinged board set deliberately opening on a hollow space below, inside a wooden box with a flat iron latch. She opened it with steady hands. She was not a woman who trembled when she found what she was looking for, and inside were maps. Detailed, precise, methodical maps drawn on heavy paper that had been kept dry and protected for years. She unfolded the first one and recognized the territory around the farmhouse immediately. Then her eyes moved past the ridge to the north, and what was on the other side of it made her go very still. A valley. Vast, sheltered, hidden from any approach by the ridge itself. Marked across it, in careful notation, water sources, mineral deposits, timber stands, grazing capacity, assessments, and hundreds of acres of property boundary lines, drawn with the precision of someone who had surveyed every inch personally. All of it marked in the same economical handwriting as her letter with a single name. Wesley Hawthorne. She was still kneeling on the floor when the porch steps creaked. She folded the maps, replaced them in the box, closed the lid, reset the board, stood. She was at the dry sink, with her hands braced on its edge, when Wesley opened the door. He stopped. He read the room the way a man reads a room when he has spent years being careful, quickly, completely. His eyes moved from her face to the floor near the dry sink, back to her face. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Rosalind turned to face him. "How much land do you own?" she asked. His jaw moved. "More than it looks like." "Those maps show hundreds of acres, past that ridge." She held his eyes. "Wesley, I need you to explain this to me. Not because I'm going to run, and not because I'm frightened. Because I am your wife, and I have been paying attention since I arrived, and I am done waiting for you to decide I'm trustworthy enough to be told the truth." Something in him shifted. Not broke. Wesley Hawthorne was not a man who broke, but released. Like a fist that had been clenched so long, the opening of it was its own kind of effort. He walked to the table. He sat down. He looked at his hands. "My father found this land 20 years ago," he said. "Before anyone else was looking in this direction. He surveyed it himself, filed the claims himself, and built what's behind that ridge over 15 years. He paused. When he died, he left it to me, every acre of it. And Voss wants it. Voss has been trying to take it since before my father was in the ground. Lawyers first, then bribes. 2 years ago, he sent men out here who burned the east fence line and told me what would come next if I didn't sell. His voice stayed level. It was a particular kind of level, the kind that comes from deciding a long time ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. I didn't sell. So you made yourself look like you had nothing worth taking. He looked up at her. A man with nothing bores Voss. A man with nothing isn't worth a long legal fight or the risk of what happens when you push someone too hard in front of witnesses. He paused. It worked. 6 years it worked. Until now, Rosalind said. Until now. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. What changed? He held her gaze. I brought you here. She was quiet for a moment. Explain that. A man who has nothing doesn't send for a wife. A man who plans to hold something, build it, protect it, pass it on. He sends for a woman he can trust. His voice was steady. Voss noticed. He's been watching since the day you arrived. I've seen his men on the ridge twice in the past 2 weeks. You've been watching them watch us. Yes. Rosalind absorbed this. Outside, the wind moved through the gaps in the walls. The lamp on the table threw their shadows long against the floor. You chose me, she said, working it through aloud, because you needed someone who would come for the right reasons. I chose you because the person who wrote to me about you said you were the most capable woman they'd known and the most consistently underestimated. He paused. I understand what it is to be underestimated. I've used it to my advantage for 6 years. She looked at her husband across the narrow table in the small spare room, and she thought about every assumption she had made since the letter arrived. The poor farmer, the modest life, the last door standing open, and she began to understand that she had not walked into a diminished life. She had walked into the center of something that had been in motion for 20 years, something that was now for the first time reaching a point of open confrontation. Wesley, she said. Yes, whatever Voss decides to do next, I want to know about it before it happens, not after. I want to be part of how you handle it, not managed, not protected from it. She held his gaze without flinching. I did not come all this way to stand behind you. I came to stand beside you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, and with complete sincerity, Yes, ma'am. It was the first time he'd called her that, and from a man of Wesley Hawthorne's particular economy of expression, it meant considerably more than most men's longest speeches. She went to bed that night with the maps still vivid in her mind, and the weight of a shared secret settling over her shoulders, heavy but manageable, the way all worthwhile things are. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind, and she was not the woman who had stood on that porch in the gray dawn and hurled a chamber pot into the yard and declared that this was not her life. She was beginning to understand what her life actually was. Across the ridge to the north, behind the wall of stone that hid everything Wesley Hawthorne had built, and everything Garrett Voss intended to destroy the valley, lay dark and vast and patient. And in town, in a well-lit office above the bank, Garrett Voss stood over a wide desk with 2 men across from him and a map of the territory spread flat between them. He had circled the ridge in red ink. He was explaining in the calm and pleasant voice of a man who has made this kind of decision before exactly how long he intended to wait before he stopped being patient. He had decided that the woman changed everything. Wesley Hawthorne alone was a man defending a secret. Wesley Hawthorne, with a woman who asked the right questions, was a man who was going to make a mistake. Voss just needed to create the right conditions for it. He smoothed the map with one hand and told his men what he wanted done. And the night outside was quiet and deep, and unaware that it was the last quiet night the Black Hollow Valley would have for a very long time. The morning after Rosalind found the maps, Wesley was already gone when she woke. Not unusual. I was always up before dawn, moving through the yard with that quiet, purposeful stride she had come to recognize, the stride of a man who checked things not out of anxiety, but out of habit, the way a soldier checks his equipment before he needs it. But this morning was different, and she knew it the moment she opened the bedroom door and found a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table, beside a fresh cup of coffee that was still warm. She picked up the paper and read it. 2 sentences. Wesley's economical hand. Rode out to check the East Ridge. Back by noon. Keep the door barred. She read those last 4 words twice. Keep the door barred. Not keep the door closed. Not stay inside. Barred. The specific word of a man who had reason to believe the difference mattered. She set the note down, drank the coffee he had made for her before leaving in the dark, and began planning her day. Not the day he had implied she should have quiet contained, waiting behind a barred door, but the day she had decided on, which involved considerably more information gathering than he had authorized. She started with Earl. The old ranch hand was in the small shed attached to the barn's east side, mending a length of harness leather with the slow, thorough movements of someone who had done this particular task several thousand times. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway and went back to his work without comment. "Earl," she said, "how long have you worked for Mr. Hawthorne?" 7 years, Earl said without looking up. "And before him, his father." She stepped into the shed and sat down on an upturned crate without being invited. Earl's hands paused for just a moment on the leather, then resumed. She took that pause as the acknowledgement it was. "Tell me about what Voss did to this fence line 2 years ago," she said. Now his hands stopped entirely. He looked up at her from beneath the gray brim of his hat, and she held his gaze and waited. And Earl, who, in 7 years of her husband's employ, had presumably been asked to keep his mouth shut about a great many things, made a decision. She could see him making right there in real time. "Wasn't just the fence," he said. "What else?" Earl set the harness on his knee and looked at the middle distance. They came out on a Thursday night. 4 men. Burned the east fence line from the creek crossing to the ridge trail. Burned the feed shed that used to stand where there's nothing now. He paused. And they shot one of the horses. Rosalind said nothing. She kept her face still. Mr. Hawthorne came out in the morning and found her. Earl's voice was flat and even, the voice of a man reporting facts, because facts were the only way he knew to carry something he hadn't been able to put down. She'd been out in this east pasture. She didn't die right away. What did Wesley do? Buried her. Fixed the fence. Rebuilt the shed. Earl looked at her steadily. Didn't sell. Did he go to the sheriff? Something moved across Earl's face, not quite a laugh, but the shadow of one. "Sheriff Beaumont and Garrett Voss play cards on Friday nights," he said. "Have done for 11 years. Rosalind absorbed that. "Earl," she said, "is there anyone in this county with the authority to act against Voss who isn't in his pocket?" Earl thought about it with genuine seriousness, turning the question over the way he turned the leather in his hands. "Judge Calloway out of Prescott. He's about the only one." He paused. "But Prescott's 60 miles from here, and Voss knows it." She nodded slowly. "Thank you." She stood to leave, and Earl said without looking up from the harness again, "Ma'am." She stopped. "He didn't tell me to keep quiet about that," Earl said. "But he didn't tell me to talk either. I'm telling you because—" He stopped, seemed to look for words he didn't usually need. "Because a person standing next to something dangerous ought to know the shape of it." She looked at the top of his gray hat. "I appreciate that, Earl, more than you know." She walked back to the farmhouse with her mind moving fast. Voss had enforcement. Voss had the sheriff. Voss had patience. 6 years of it, and he had the resources to outlast a man who appeared to have nothing. What had kept Wesley safe was the appearance of having nothing to take. But that armor had cracked the day she arrived on the wagon, and every day since Voss had been watching the crack widen. She was still working through it at the kitchen table when she heard the horse in the yard. Not Wesley's horse. Wrong gait, wrong weight, wrong sound on the frozen ground. She stood up and was at the window before she fully decided to be staying to one side of the frame, the way a cautious person stays watching without being seen watching. 2 riders in the yard. They had not come to the door. They were sitting on their horses near the fence line, not doing anything, just looking at the house with the particular patience of men who were being paid to look. Watching the farmhouse. In the middle of the morning. Without knocking or calling out or announcing themselves in any way that gave them a legitimate reason to be there. She watched them for 90 seconds. They didn't move. Then she walked to the door, lifted the bar, opened it wide, and stepped out onto the porch. Both riders looked at her. She looked back at them with the same pleasant, untroubled expression she had used on Decker in the general store, the one that was agreeable on the surface and absolutely immovable underneath. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called. A pause. "Just riding through, ma'am," one of them said. She folded her arms across her chest and stayed exactly where she was on the porch and looked at them with patient interest. "Well, you're welcome to ride through then." Another pause. Then they rode through. She watched them go until they were past the fence line and down the trail, and then she went back inside and barred the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her heart beating considerably faster than her face had let on. They had not been riding through. Riding through men did not sit motionless in a yard for 90 seconds looking at a house. They had been there to be seen, a reminder, a pressure, a quiet message delivered in the language of men who specialized in quiet messages. She sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the county land office in the nearest town requesting public record documentation of all property claims filed in the Black Hollow territory in the past 25 years. The second was to a name she had found in the margin of one of Wesley's maps, written in smaller script beneath a property boundary notation, a surveyor named H. Galt, with an address in a town 40 miles east. She didn't know yet what H. Galt knew, or whether he was still operating. But a surveyor whose name was written in Wesley's handwriting on a map of land worth fighting over was a person worth writing to. She sealed both letters, put them in her coat pocket, and was folding the coat over her arm when Wesley came through the door at 11:30. He read her face the moment he walked in the same way he had read the room the night she found the maps. "What happened?" he said. "2 of Voss's men in the yard this morning, sitting their horses and watching the house." His jaw set. "Did they?" "They didn't approach. I went out onto the porch and they left." She set the coat on the chair and looked at him. "I also spoke to Earl about the fence line and the horse." He was very still. "I'm not angry that you didn't tell me," she said. "I understand why you didn't. But Wesley, I need to understand what we're actually dealing with, and I need you to stop making those decisions for me." He took off his hat and set it on the hook and stood there for a moment with his back to her. She waited. When he turned around, his expression was the kind that arrives after a man has argued with himself and conceded. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Everything." He sat down. And for the first time since she had arrived in Black Hollow, Wesley Hawthorne told her everything. It took 2 hours. He talked the way he did everything methodically, without embellishment in the flat, steady voice that she had initially mistaken for coldness, and now understood was simply how truth sounded in his mouth. He told her about his father's original survey, conducted alone on horseback over 4 months in 1861, mapping a valley that the railroad men had dismissed as inaccessible and the cattle barons hadn't yet noticed. He told her about the water 3 separate spring-fed streams that ran year-round, which in that country was worth more than gold and considerably harder to come by. He told her about the mineral deposits his father had identified in the Eastern Ridge silver-bearing ore, not extensively surveyed, but enough to have been noted in the land office records if anyone was looking at the right documents. "Voss is looking at the right documents," Rosalind said. "Yes." "Has he filed any competing claims?" 2. "Both challenged and both dismissed because my father's original filing was airtight." A pause. "But dismissed claims can be refiled, especially when a judge can be persuaded to reinterpret the boundary language." "Sheriff Beaumont and Garrett Voss play cards on Friday nights," she said. "Earl told me." Wesley's eyes sharpened. "You got more out of Earl in 1 morning than I have in 7 years. Earl talks to people who ask him direct questions." She folded her hands on the table. "Who is H. Galt?" A silence. "Where did you hear that name?" "Your handwriting. East margin of the second map, below the boundary notation for the Spring Creek section." He looked at her for a long moment. "Henry Galt is the surveyor who worked with my father on the original claim. He's the only other person alive who knows the full extent of what's behind that ridge." He paused. I haven't contacted him in 4 years. I thought the less connection I maintained with anyone who knew the real value of the land, the safer we all were. I wrote him a letter this morning, Rosalind said. I also wrote to the land office in town, requesting copies of all property filings in this territory for the past 25 years. Wesley stared at her. She held his gaze steadily. We can't defend what we don't fully document. If Voss moves legally, or moves, and then covers it with legal language after the fact, we need our own documentation in order, not in a box under the floorboards. She paused. I'm not criticizing how you've managed this. You've managed it alone, and you've managed it well. But you're not alone anymore. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the wind picked up, pushing against the walls, and the house groaned and held. Rosalind, he said finally. Yes. I didn't bring you out here to put you in the middle of this. I know that. She looked at him steadily. But here I am, and I'm not going anywhere. She paused. So, tell me about the valley. Something happened to his face when she said those words. Not a dramatic change. Just a loosening, the particular relaxation of a man who has been holding something tightly for so long that being given permission to set it down feels almost unfamiliar. He talked about the valley for a long time. He talked about it the way she had never heard him talk about anything, with an aliveness in his voice that she hadn't been sure was in him, because everything she'd seen of Wesley Hawthorne until now had been careful and contained and measured. But the valley was different. When he talked about the valley, the careful man became someone else. Someone who had walked every acre of that land and knew it the way a person knows something they have loved for a very long time. 340 acres of sheltered grassland behind the ridge. 12 permanent ranch hands who had been with him for years, living and working in the valley visible from no road and no trail that Voss or his men had found. Cattle over 400 head, well-bred, well-fed. 3 barns. A stone house his father had begun, and Wesley had completed 5 years ago, built to last a century. You've been running a full operation this entire time, Rosalind said. Right behind that ridge. Yes. And no one in town knows. Earl knows. The ranch hands know. Henry Galt knows. He looked at her. Now you know. She sat with that for a moment. The men on the ridge this morning, she said. Have they come close enough to see over it? Not yet. The trail that leads to the valley entrance is disguised. It looks like a washout. He paused. But Voss is getting closer. He's been mapping the territory methodically. He knows something is there. He just hasn't found the way in. How long before he does? Wesley's expression was level, but not comfortable. Weeks, maybe less. The word dropped into the kitchen like something heavy. Weeks. She stood up and went to the window, not to look at anything specific, but because she needed to move while she thought. Her mind was working through the problem, the way she worked through any problem, laying out the components, identifying the dependencies, finding the sequence. We need 3 things, she said without turning around. We need the legal documentation tightened and filed in a place Voss can't interfere with it. We need Judge Calloway and Prescott to know this situation exists before it becomes a crisis, not after. And we need Henry Galt to provide a formal survey deposition that confirms your father's original claim. She turned. In that order. Wesley was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. It was something that lived in the neighborhood of respect, but it was quieter than that and more private, and she had the sense that it was not an expression he produced often or for many people. You worked that out just now, he said. I worked some of it out this morning and the rest just now. She sat back down. Can we get a rider to Prescott without Voss knowing? Earl, she agreed. He moves around the territory without attracting attention. Is he willing? He'll go if I ask him. Then ask him today. She paused. And Wesley, the men who came this morning will report back to Voss that I'm here, that I'm watching, and that I didn't frighten. She held his gaze. He's going to start seeing me as a variable he didn't account for. That's either an advantage or a liability depending on what we do next. Wesley was quiet for a moment. Which do you want it to be? She looked at her husband across the table. This man she had known for less than a month. This man who swept his floors and cared for his horses, and chose his words like a man who knew the weight of each one. And she thought about the valley behind the ridge, the water and the grass, and the 400 head of cattle, and the stone house his father had started, and he had finished. And she thought about a woman who had stood on a porch in her nightgown, in the gray dawn, and thrown a chamber pot into the yard and said, "This is not my life." "An advantage," she said. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "Then we have work to do." They sent Earl to Prescott that afternoon with a letter for Judge Calloway, sealed in plain paper with no name on the outside. Earl left before supper time, moving quietly, taking the back trail through the creek crossing rather than the main road, the way a man moves when he knows he might be watched. Wesley watched him go from the yard with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and Rosalind stood beside him and watched too. "He'll make it," she said. "He always does," Wesley said. They went inside. That night, they sat at the kitchen table after supper, and Wesley spread out one of the maps not from the box under the floor, but from memory drawing with a pencil on paper, the territory as he knew it, marking Voss's known positions and the routes his men had used. Rosalind studied it with the full concentration she had once used to track accounts in her father's shop the years before he died, and left her nothing but debt and a landlady's patience that eventually ran out. "Here," she said, pointing to a section of the map. "If his men are approaching from the south trail, they'll hit this drainage and lose the ridge line. They'll have to backtrack to find the approach. That buys a day, maybe two. It buys enough time to get the documentation back from the land office." She traced a line with her finger. "And if Galt responds quickly—" "If," Wesley said. He was not pessimistic by nature, but he was precise, and precision required acknowledging the difference between what you hoped and what you knew. "If Galt responds," she amended, "we can have the survey deposition in hand before Voss moves legally." She paused. "Has he ever moved legally without preparing the physical pressure first?" Wesley thought about it. "No. He uses the physical threat to soften a position. Then he comes in with lawyers while the other person is still rattled." "Then we make sure we're not rattled." She looked up from the map. "What's the next physical thing he's likely to do?" The question hung in the air between them, and Wesley's expression shifted a slight tightening, a calculation behind the eyes. "The water," he said. "The main creek feeding the south pasture runs through a stretch of open territory before it hits my property line. If he dams it or diverts it, he cuts your water. Not permanently, but long enough to stress the cattle and give him a legal opening to claim the land is being mismanaged and petition for a receivership." She said the word before he finished the sentence, and he looked at her sharply. She met his gaze. "My father had a business rival who tried exactly that. Used a water dispute as a pretext for a receivership filing. It's slow enough to look legitimate and fast enough to cause real damage before it's overturned." Wesley stared at her. "Your father was in business." "My father was in business, and my father also lost a legal fight because he didn't know what was coming until it had already arrived." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not my father." A silence. The lamp between them threw its light in a warm circle, and outside the wind had come up again, restless against the walls, and the house pushed back against it the way it always did. "No," Wesley said quietly. "You are not." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was a moment that didn't need anything added to it, and they were both the kind of people who understood that, and so nothing was added. "We check the creek line tomorrow," she said. "Before dawn," he said. "Before dawn," she agreed. She was at the bedroom door when he said her name. She turned. Howe was still at the table, the pencil-drawn map in front of him, his hands flat on either side of it, looking at her with that expression, the private one, the one she was beginning to understand was reserved for things he considered worth trusting. "I'm glad you wrote back," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "So am I," she said. She went to bed. Before dawn came 3 things happened. The first was that Earl, 40 miles east on the Prescott Road, stopped his horse at a creek crossing in the dark and listened for a full minute before crossing, because something in the tree line sounded wrong, and Earl, who had been moving carefully through this territory for years, trusted that kind of instinct absolutely. He crossed downstream instead, where the bank was thick with brush, and he picked up the road again, a quarter-mile east of the crossing, and he never saw the two men who were watching the road from the cottonwoods above the original crossing point. The second thing was that a letter arrived in the night post at the farmhouse, not delivered by any regular means, but left folded on the porch under a stone, and found by Rosalind when she opened the door before dawn to check the yard. It had no signature. It had 6 words. He knows about the valley. Leave now. She stood on the porch in the cold dark, with that paper in her hands, and felt the situation shift under her feet, the way ground shifts before it gives way. Then she went back inside and woke Wesley. He read it twice. His face was absolutely still. "Who sent it?" she asked. "I don't know." He turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. "Someone who knows what Voss knows. Someone who wanted us warned. Someone on Voss's side who isn't entirely on Voss's side," Rosalind said. Wesley looked at her. "Or someone who's been watching this situation long enough to have a stake in how it ends." She thought about Decker in the general store, his false warmth, and his knowing sideways glances. She thought about the woman in the blue dress on the sidewalk and her expensive contempt. She thought about the specific quality of the silence in Black Hollow, whenever Garrett Voss's name was mentioned. Not comfortable silence, not the silence of people who were satisfied with their arrangement, but the silence of people who were accustomed to swallowing things. "Someone in town," she said. "Someone who can't act openly but can drop a piece of paper on a porch in the dark." "Yes." "Can you identify who?" He thought about it with genuine care. "Maybe, but not quickly. We don't have time to identify them." She folded the note and put it in her pocket. "We need to act on what it tells us." She looked at him directly. "He knows about the valley, which means the camouflage is done, which means we've lost the advantage of looking like we have nothing." She paused. "Wesley, if Voss moves on the valley directly, the ranch hands can hold it." His voice was level, but had a new edge to it. Not panic, not even urgency, but the precision of a man who has just recalculated a timeline. "There are 12 of them. They're armed. They know the terrain. They've never been in a direct confrontation with Voss's men." "No." "And Voss's men have." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. "We need to get to the valley," she said. "Today." Wesley had already picked up his coat. The third thing that happened before dawn was that in Garrett Voss's well-lit office above the bank, a man in a clean coat spread a new map across the desk. Not a map of the whole territory, but a detailed rendering of the ridge trail and the valley behind it, drawn with the precision of someone who had been there. Voss looked at it for a long time. He looked at the water sources, the pasture acreage, the location of the stone house. Then he looked up at the man who had brought it and said in his pleasant and practiced voice, "When?" "Tomorrow night," the man said, "while the husband's occupied with the creek line." Voss smoothed the map with one hand. "Good," he said. "And the woman?" The man hesitated. "She's not what we expected," he said carefully. Voss looked at him for a moment with the flat patience of someone who has heard that kind of equivocation before and finds it tedious. "She's a farmer's wife," Voss said. "Handle it accordingly." The man nodded and left. Voss looked at the map for another long moment. Then he looked at the window where the town of Black Hollow lay dark and quiet, and entirely unaware of what was being decided in this room for the last time. He had been patient for 6 years. He was finished being patient. They rode out before the sun came up. Wesley had the horses saddled in 20 minutes, moving through the barn in the dark, with the efficiency of a man who had done difficult things in difficult conditions, enough times that urgency no longer made him clumsy. Rosalind was dressed and ready when he came to the door, her coat buttoned, her hair pinned back, the folded anonymous note still in her pocket like a coal that hadn't cooled. She had not asked him whether she was coming. He had not suggested she stay behind. That she thought was its own kind of progress. The trail to the valley entrance was nothing like what she had imagined from the maps. Maps showed distance and direction, and the shape of terrain, but they didn't show the particular quality of a path that had been deliberately made to look like It led nowhere. The way the brush had been encouraged to grow across the opening. The way the ground had been worn in a false direction, first before turning sharply left, behind a shelf of rock that you would never notice unless you already knew it was there. Wesley navigated it without hesitation, without a lantern in the last full dark before dawn, and she followed close behind him and said nothing and paid attention to everything. When they came through the rock shelf and the trail opened out, Rosalind stopped her horse. She had known intellectually what was behind the ridge. She had read the maps. She had heard Wesley describe it. She had built a picture in her mind from those components, and she had thought the picture was adequate. It was not adequate. The valley stretched out in the gray pre-dawn light, with the particular grandeur of something that has been left alone long enough to become fully itself. The grass was dark and thick. The streams she had seen marked on the maps caught what little light existed and threw it back in long silver lines. The barns were solid and large. The cattle were shapes in the distance moving with the slow purpose of animals that had never been stressed or starved. And at the center of it, built from the same stone as the ridge itself, was a house that looked like it had grown there. "Wesley," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I know," he said. He had heard something in her voice that she hadn't been fully aware of putting there. "You built this." "My father started it." He was looking at the valley with the expression she had seen before the private alive one. "I finished it." She looked at her husband in the gray dawn light and thought about the man the town of Black Hollow had spent 6 years laughing at, the poor farmer with the cracked boots and the sagging barn. And she thought about what it took to hold something this enormous in secret for that long, and what it cost, and why a person would pay that cost. And she understood something she hadn't fully understood until this moment. Wesley Hawthorne was not hiding because he was ashamed of what he had. He was hiding because he loved it too much to risk losing it. She understood that completely. "All right," she said, and something in her voice had changed. Too settled the way a decision settles when it stops being a decision and becomes simply a fact. "Show me what we're defending." The ranch hands were already up when they rode in. 12 men ranging from a boy of about 17 to a weathered Mexican vaquero named Cristobal, who had been with Wesley's father before Wesley was born. They greeted Wesley with the easy familiarity of people who have worked alongside someone long enough that formality has been replaced by something more durable. They looked at Rosalind with curiosity and without rudeness, and she looked back at each of them directly, because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to establish that you were not a person to be underestimated was to make absolutely clear from the first moment that you were paying attention. Cristobal was the one who spoke first. He was a compact man with dark eyes and a white scar along his jaw, and the particular stillness of someone who had navigated more difficult situations than this one. He took off his hat when he addressed her, which was not a gesture of subordination, but of the specific respect offered to someone who has earned consideration before they've done anything to earn it. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "we heard you were coming." "Did you?" She glanced at Wesley. "Cristobal hears things," Wesley said by way of explanation that explained nothing. "We heard Voss found the valley," Cristobal said. He said it the way men in difficult situations state facts plainly without softening, because softening a hard fact was a luxury that tended to get people killed. "We've been preparing since midnight." "Preparing how?" Rosalind asked. He told her. They had moved the cattle from the south pasture to the north end of the valley, away from the most likely approach route. They had positioned 2 men on the ridge above the valley entrance with clear lines of sight to the main trail. They had locked the barns and moved what couldn't be easily replaced into the stone house. They had sent the youngest ranch hand, the 17-year-old whose name was Tommy, out the back of the valley on foot, with instructions to reach the nearest neighbor. A rancher named Aldous Briggs, who owed Wesley a considerable favor before sunup. It was good preparation. It was the preparation of men who knew their terrain and knew their business. It was also, Rosalind assessed, in about 30 seconds preparation for a defensive position that assumed the attack would come from the front. "Cristobal," she said. "The anonymous note said Voss planned to move while my husband was occupied with the creek line." She looked at Wesley. "He knows your patterns. He's been watching long enough to know how you respond to a water threat." She turned back to Cristobal. "If you were Voss, and you wanted to draw the man who owned this valley away from it, how would you do it?" Cristobal looked at her for a moment with those dark assessing eyes. Then he looked at Wesley. "She's right," he said. "I know," Wesley said. "The creek diversion is a feint," Rosalind said. "He draws you south to the creek line. You take men with you, because that's what a sensible person does, and while you're gone." "He comes in from the East Ridge," Cristobal finished. His voice had gone flat in the way voices go when a man has just recalculated a threat and found it larger than he thought. "The East Approach. We've never fortified it, because we never believed he knew it existed." "Does he know it exists?" Rosalind asked. Cristobal and Wesley looked at each other. "The man who drew the map on Voss's desk," Wesley said slowly. "The one detailed enough to show the valley interior. Would have to have come in from the east," Cristobal said. "Because you can't see the valley interior from the south approach. You can only see it if you come in from the top." The three of them stood in the early morning silence of the valley and absorbed the full shape of what that meant. Someone had been inside the valley. Not recently. The map Voss had shown his men was detailed enough to have taken time to produce, which meant it had been made over multiple visits carefully without triggering the ranch hand's awareness. Which meant whoever made it was either very skilled or very familiar with the valley's rhythms. Or both. "Tommy," Wesley said abruptly. Cristobal went very still. "Tommy has been here 8 months, Wesley said. His voice had not changed pitch or volume, but something had left it. The last layer of assumption that comes from trusting people you've let inside your perimeter. He was the only hire in the past year." "He's the one you sent out the back," Rosalind said. "Yes." Cristobal's jaw was tight. Alone, with a head start, and no one watching which direction he actually went. The silence that followed that sentence had weight. Wesley moved first. "Get 2 men on the East Ridge, right now, not in 10 minutes, now." He was already turning toward the horses. "Rosalind." "I'm not staying in the stone house," she said immediately. He stopped. He looked at her with the look of a man who wants to argue and has already calculated that he doesn't have time for it. "Stay with Cristobal," he said. "Do not go near the east approach without me." "Go," she said. He went. Cristobal was already calling to the ranch hands in a voice that was not loud, but had the particular carrying quality of absolute authority. Men moved. The valley, which had been still and quiet moments ago, became a place of rapid, organized action, not panic, because these were not men who panicked, but the sharp, purposeful movement of people who understood that the margin between prepared and unprepared had just gotten very thin. Rosalind went to the stone house. Not to stay inside it, to think. She stood in the main room of the house Wesley's father had begun, and Wesley had finished, and she looked at the walls and the fireplace and the wooden shelves with their practical contents. And she thought about Tommy, 17 years old, sent out the back alone, trusted because he was young, and young was assumed to be uncalculated. She thought about the map on Voss's desk, detailed and precise, the kind of map that required access and time. She thought about the anonymous note on the porch. "He knows about the valley. Leave now, left in the night by someone who wanted them warned but couldn't do it openly." And she thought about the timing. Voss had told his men tomorrow night, while the husband is occupied with the creek line. But the anonymous note had arrived last night, which meant whoever left the note had been in Voss's office when the plan was made, or had heard the plan made, and had come directly here to warn them. Not slowly, not after consideration, directly. Someone in Voss's circle, someone close enough to hear the plan, and frightened enough or decent enough to act on that fear or decency immediately. She was still turning that over in her mind when the first shot was fired. It came from the East Ridge, distant and sharp, and it was followed immediately by a second. Not a signal, not a warning shot. The measured sound of men shooting at something specific. Rosalind was out the door before the echo of the second shot had finished. Cristobal was already moving toward the east side of the valley with 3 men behind him. He saw her coming and opened his mouth to say something she was not going to stand still for. "I can shoot," she said before he spoke. "Can you use another person who can shoot?" He closed his mouth, looked at her for one full second. "You ever shot at a man?" "No," she said. "Have you ever stood in front of a room full of people who were laughing at you and held your ground anyway?" Cristobal almost smiled. It was very brief. "Come on," he said. The east ridge was steeper than the south approach, and climbing it was not elegant. It required hands as much as feet, and her skirt was a considerable inconvenience, and she made a mental note about practical clothing that she filed away for later, because right now there was no later. There was only the next handhold and the sound of men moving above them, and the particular quality of silence that falls between gunshots when everyone is deciding what to do next. They came over the ridge lip onto a narrow shelf of rock, and Rosalind saw them. 4 men. Not 12, not an army 4, which was either Voss being efficient or Voss being confident, and she suspected it was confidence, because a man who had planned this particular approach for this particular night, while the valley's owner was drawn away to the south, believed he was walking into something undefended. He had been wrong about that. 2 of Wesley's ranch hands were positioned behind a rock outcropping on the far end of the shelf, and they had stopped the advance, not eliminated it, but stopped it, which was not the same thing. The 4 men were pinned behind their own position, unable to move forward without exposing themselves and unwilling to retreat, because retreating meant reporting failure to Garrett Voss. Cristobal assessed it in about 4 seconds. He deployed his 3 men with quick, quiet hand signals that Rosalind watched and understood. 1 man to the left flank to cut the retreat route. 1 man to hold the ridge access point. 1 man to move forward and tighten the pinch, which left Cristobal standing next to Rosalind on the ridge lip. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said quietly, "I need you to do something. Name it. Go back down. Take the south trail out of the valley. Go to town." He held her gaze. "Not to hide, to find the sheriff." She stared at him. "Sheriff Beaumont plays cards with Voss every Friday night. I know." His voice was level. "I need you to walk into the sheriff's office and tell him that Garrett Voss has sent armed men onto Wesley Hawthorne's property, and there is shooting happening right now. I need you to say it in front of as many people as possible. I need it on record in public in a voice too loud to ignore." He paused. "What happens on this ridge tonight can be made to look like anything Voss wants it to look like, if there's no public record before he gets his story straight. You understand?" She understood immediately. "You need a witness who can't be discredited." "I need the owner's wife," he said. Walking into the middle of town alone in the middle of the night, demanding the sheriff respond to an armed attack on her property. His dark eyes were steady. "That is not something Voss's lawyers can explain away easily." She was already moving. The south trail out of the valley took 12 minutes at a fast walk, and she did it in 9, and her lungs burned and her boots slipped twice on the frozen ground, and she kept moving, and when she came through the valley entrance and onto the open trail, she broke into a run because the cold air told her it was closer to midnight than she'd realized, and she needed to be in town before Voss's men finished whatever they'd been sent to finish, and rode in ahead of her to set the narrative. She rode the horse they'd left at the valley entrance hard for 40 minutes. Black Hollow was not asleep. This surprised her until she understood why the shots on the ridge had been audible from the southern road, and in a small town sound traveled, and people who lived in a place where a powerful man regularly made other people's problems disappear had learned to stay awake when they heard things in the night. There were lights in windows. There were 2 men on the sidewalk outside the saloon who went quiet when she rode in. She dismounted at the sheriff's office and went straight through the door without knocking. Sheriff Beaumont was at his desk. He was a heavy man with tired eyes and the look of someone who had been expecting a difficult night and was not surprised to see it arrive. There were 2 other men in the office, a deputy whose name she didn't know, and standing near the window with his hat in his hands and a complicated expression on his face, a man she recognized. Decker, the general store owner. She filed that away and spoke before anyone could react to her presence. "My name is Rosalind Hawthorne," she said loudly and clearly to Beaumont, and to the room, and to anyone within range of an open window. "Garrett Voss has sent armed men onto my husband's property tonight. There is shooting happening on our East Ridge right now. I am demanding as a property owner in this county that you ride out and do your duty." Beaumont looked at her with those tired eyes. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I said I am demanding," she said. She did not raise her voice. She made it harder instead, the specific hardness of a woman who has been underestimated enough times to know exactly how to make the next person think twice about trying it. "I am stating in front of witnesses that armed men are on our land right now. If you fail to respond and someone is killed, that failure will be on your record, and I will personally see it reaches every person with the authority to act on it, starting with Judge Calloway and Prescott, to whom my husband has already sent a communication." Beaumont went still. The mention of Judge Calloway did something to his face that she watched happen in real time, a calculation, a reassessment. The look of a man who has two masters and has just been shown that one of them has a longer reach than he'd assumed. "Now," he started. "Additionally," Rosalind said, "I have in my possession documentary evidence of all property claims filed in this territory for the past 25 years, and a formal survey deposition from the original surveyor of the Hawthorne land grant." This was not entirely true. She had sent letters requesting these things. But the distinction between having sent for evidence and having it was a distinction that would take time to verify, and time was exactly what she was manufacturing right now. "I would encourage you, Sheriff, to consider very carefully which side of this situation you want to be associated with when it is fully examined by outside authority." A silence that had the specific texture of a room holding its breath. Then Decker spoke. He spoke from his position by the window quietly, and what he said surprised everyone in the room, including apparently himself. "She's telling the truth," he said. "About Voss's men. I saw them ride out the South Road 2 hours ago. 4 of them, armed." He paused. He was looking at his hat in his hands, with the expression of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for a long time, and has finally decided that carrying it further is more painful than setting it down. "I've been seeing things like that for 6 years. Beaumont looked at Decker with the look of a man whose arrangement has just developed a very significant complication. Rosalind looked at Decker and understood in a single moment of clear recognition who had left the note on their porch. "Beaumont," she said more quietly now. "Ride out. You can sort out your arrangement with Voss later. Right now, there are men on my property, and my husband is there, and I need you to ride out and make this official." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and reached for his coat. They rode out together. Beaumont, his deputy. Rosalind, and unexpectedly Decker, who had put on his hat and followed them out the door without being asked, and had not explained himself further, which she respected. The ride back took longer than her ride in, because Beaumont set a more measured pace, and she bit down on the impatience that wanted her to move faster and held her horse to his speed, because what mattered was not arriving quickly, but arriving with the right people. What she found when they rode into the valley entrance made her heart knock hard against her ribs for exactly 1 second before she controlled it. Wesley was there. He was standing at the entrance to the valley with Cristobal beside him, and he was unhurt, and his expression when he saw her come through the entrance ahead of Beaumont and his deputy shifted through 3 things in very rapid succession. Relief assessment, and something that was not quite pride, but lived in its immediate vicinity. 4 men were seated on the ground with their hands bound with 2 ranch hands standing over them. They were Voss's men. She recognized one of them from the farmhouse yard the morning they had ridden into her yard to watch and intimidate. He looked considerably less comfortable now than he had then. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Cristobal said as she dismounted. His voice was the same measured, even tone it always was, but there was something in it. "You made good time." "I ran," she said simply. Wesley came to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face with the thorough attention he gave to things he needed to fully understand. And then he said quietly, "So only she heard, you went to Beaumont." "And I may have slightly overstated the extent of our documentation," she said, equally quiet. His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the thing that happened to Wesley Hawthorne's face when something almost became a smile. "How slightly?" "I said we had it in hand. We have sent for it." She held his gaze. "Is there a meaningful legal difference in this specific situation?" "No," he said. "There isn't." "Good." She turned to face Beaumont, who had dismounted and was looking at the four bound men with the expression of a man whose careful arrangement has just publicly unraveled. "Sheriff, you have 4 men who rode onto private property carrying arms and were engaged in an attack on that property. I'd like to know what you intend to do about it." Beaumont looked at the men. He looked at Wesley. He looked at Rosalind. He was doing the calculations she needed him to do. Voss, on one side, a judge in Prescott on the other, and a woman in front of him who had just walked into his office in the middle of the night and made herself impossible to pretend away. "I'll take them in," he said. It sounded like it cost him something. "Thank you," she said. As Beaumont and his deputy moved toward the prisoners, Decker came to stand beside Rosalind. He was still holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, looking at the ground. "It was you," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." His voice was low. "I've been watching Voss operate for 11 years. I've kept quiet because—" He stopped. "Because a man with a store full of goods can't afford an enemy with Voss's reach. That's the truth of it, and I'm not proud of it." "Why now?" she asked. He looked up. He looked at Wesley, who was talking to Cristobal across the yard. "Because your husband never bent," he said. 6 years Voss pushed, and Wesley Hawthorne didn't move an inch. "I've watched a lot of men bend to Voss. Some of them bent so far they're still there on the ground." He put his hat back on. "And then you came. And you walked into my store, and you answered him back in a way nobody in this town had ever quite answered him back. And I thought—" He stopped again. "I thought, if those two can hold, maybe this town can remember it had a spine." Rosalind looked at him for a moment. "Decker," she said, "are you willing to make a formal statement to Judge Calloway about what you've witnessed over the past 6 years?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I believe I am." She nodded once. "Good." Across the valley, the sky above the eastern ridge had begun to change the specific darkness that comes just before a dark starts to lift. Rosalind stood in the valley that Wesley's father had found, and Wesley had built, and that Garrett Voss had spent 6 years trying to take, and she felt the cold air on her face, and the solid ground under her feet, and the particular satisfaction of a person who has done exactly what was needed in exactly the time it needed to be done. But Voss was not here. 4 men sat bound on the ground, and the operation had failed, and Beaumont was going to take the men in because he had run out of room to pretend it wasn't his job, and Decker was willing to testify, and Earl was somewhere on the Prescott Road, carrying a letter to Judge Calloway, and all of that was real, and all of it mattered. But Voss was not here, and Voss had been patient for 6 years, and a man who had been patient for 6 years did not become reckless after one failure. He recalculated. He found the angle he had missed. He came back from a different direction, and he came back harder because losing in front of witnesses was the one thing a man like Garrett Voss could not absorb without response. She thought about what Cristobal had said on the ridge. What happens on this ridge tonight can be made to look like anything Voss wants it to look like if there's no public record. She had created a public record. But public records could be challenged, and witnesses could be pressured, and a man with 6 years of patience and enough money to outlast a legal fight was not finished. He was wounded. Wounded men were more dangerous than comfortable ones. She was still holding that thought when Wesley came to stand beside her. He stood close enough that their arms nearly touched, which was as close as he had stood to her voluntarily since she arrived, and he looked at the same thing. She was looking at the ridge in the pre-dawn dark, the valley below it, the solid stone house at its center. "He'll come back," she said. "Yes," Wesley said. Harder. "Yes." She looked at her husband's profile in the dark, the set jaw, the steady eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and had just for the first time been given someone to hold it with. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. Wesley looked at her. "We will be," he said. And somewhere in town, in the well-lit office above the bank, Garrett Voss stood at his window and watched Beaumont ride in with 4 of his men in custody, and his pleasant practiced face went through something that it very rarely went through. It went through the specific cold clarity of a man who has just understood that he has been underestimating someone. Not Wesley Hawthorne. He had always known Wesley Hawthorne was more than he appeared. The woman. He had underestimated the woman. His hand tightened once on the windowsill, and then he turned away from the glass and sat down at his desk, and he began to think in the careful, patient, methodical way that had made him the most powerful man in Black Hollow County for the better part of a decade. He was not finished. He was just beginning. Beaumont rode back into Black Hollow with 4 prisoners and a problem he hadn't had when he woke up that morning. The problem was not the prisoners. Prisoners were manageable. Prisoners could be processed and held and eventually released on technicalities that a man with Voss's resources could produce without much effort. The problem was the witness list. Because Rosalind Hawthorne had walked into his office in the middle of the night and stated her case loudly and clearly in front of his deputy, in front of Decker, and within easy earshot of an open window that faced a street where 2 men had been standing on the sidewalk outside the saloon. By the time the sun came up, most of Black Hollow knew what had happened on the East Ridge. Rosalind understood this the moment she rode back into town with Wesley beside her and saw the quality of the silence on the street. It was a different silence than the one she had ridden into on her first Saturday in Black Hollow. That silence had been the comfortable silence of a community performing its contempt for someone it had already decided didn't matter. This silence was something else. This was the silence of people who were reassessing. She felt their eyes, and she kept her chin level, and she rode to the general store and dismounted and went inside because they needed supplies, and because walking into a room full of people who were watching you was considerably better done on your own terms than theirs. Decker was already behind his counter. He had ridden back ahead of them, and he looked like a man who had not slept and had no intention of pretending otherwise. He looked up when she came in, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement brief and mutual of the kind that doesn't require words. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said. "Decker." She set her list on the counter. "I need these things, and I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The woman in the blue dress," she said. "The one who laughed on the sidewalk our first Saturday in town. Who is she?" Decker looked at the list in his hands. "Margaret Voss," he said. "Garrett's sister-in-law, widow of his younger brother." Rosalind absorbed that. "She lives in town. The house on the north end of Main Street, the one with the white shutters." He paused. "She's not unkind by nature. She laughs at what Garrett expects her to laugh at because she owes him the house she lives in, and she knows it." She thought about that for a moment. Then she picked up her list and handed it back. "Fill that order, please. I'll be back in 20 minutes. She left before Decker could ask where she was going. Wesley was outside with the horses. He looked at her when she came out, reading her face the way he always did, quickly, completely. "What are you doing?" he said. "I'm going to speak to Margaret Voss," she said. He was very still for a moment. "Why?" "Because a woman who laughs at what she's expected to laugh at is a woman who knows something she hasn't been asked to tell yet." She met his eyes. "Voss's pressure on this town runs through people who are afraid of him. If even one of them stops being afraid." "Rosalind." His voice was careful. "Margaret Voss is not Decker. She has direct ties to Garrett. Anything you say to her." "We'll get back to him," she said. "I know that. I'm counting on it." He looked at her for a long moment. "What exactly are you planning to say to her?" "The truth," she said, "which is the one thing people in Voss's circle are least prepared to hear." She walked to the white shuttered house at the north end of Main Street and knocked before she had time to talk herself into being cautious about it. Margaret Voss opened the door in a morning dress, her dark hair not yet pinned, and the expression on her face when she saw Rosalind was not what Rosalind had expected. It was not contempt. It was something that looked remarkably like shame. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Margaret said. "Mrs. Voss." Rosalind kept her voice even. "I'd like to speak with you if you're willing, and I'd like to do it without pretending that we met under circumstances that were kind to either of us." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Rosalind went in. They sat in a small parlor with a cold fireplace, and the particular quiet of a house where someone lives alone and has made a kind of peace with that. Margaret Voss was perhaps 40, with the careful posture of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible, in a life that was technically comfortable and practically constrained. "I heard what happened last night," Margaret said. She was looking at her hands in her lap. "I heard it from my housekeeper before dawn." "And," Rosalind said. Margaret looked up. "And I am not surprised." She paused. "I have not been surprised by anything my brother-in-law has done for a very long time. That doesn't mean I've been comfortable with it." "Have you said so to anyone?" The answer was visible in her face before she spoke it. "I have no money of my own. The house belongs to Garrett. My situation here exists because he chooses to maintain it." Her voice was flat with the specific flatness of a truth told so many times internally that speaking it aloud requires no particular effort. "Women in my position do not say things." "Women in your position," Rosalind said carefully, "are exactly the kind of witnesses a judge in Prescott would find credible, because they have nothing obvious to gain." Margaret stared at her. "I'm not asking you to be brave for my sake," Rosalind said. "I'm telling you that a formal investigation is coming. Judge Calloway has been contacted. When Calloway begins asking questions, the people Voss has pressured into silence are going to have a choice. Talk to Calloway's people now, with some control over what they say and how they say it, or wait until the investigation makes the silence itself look like complicity." She paused. "I don't know which category you fall into, but I thought you deserved to know the choice was coming before it arrived without warning." The room was very quiet. Margaret Voss looked at Rosalind Hawthorne, at the full, soft figure, and the steady brown eyes, and the expression of a woman who had walked a very long way to get to this parlor and was not going to apologize for arriving, and her face did something complicated and private. "He's going to come after you directly," Margaret said. "When the prisoners are released, and they will be released. Beaumont doesn't have the spine to hold them. Garrett will change his approach. He won't use muscle again, not after last night. He'll use the law." She paused. "He has a lawyer in Phoenix named Alderman who specializes in disputed land claims. He's very good. He's beaten 3 claims in this territory in the past 2 years." "What's his method?" Rosalind asked immediately. "He finds procedural errors in the original filings. Small things. Dating discrepancies. Witness signature irregularities. Things that shouldn't matter, but can be made to matter in front of the right judge." Margaret paused. "Your original surveyor, Galt Alderman, will go after his credentials first. If he can establish that Galt was operating outside his licensed territory at the time of the original survey, the filing becomes challengeable." Rosalind held very still. "How do you know about Galt?" "Because Garrett mentioned him 3 months ago," Margaret said. "When he first found the valley." She looked at Rosalind steadily. "He's been preparing this for 3 months, Mrs. Hawthorne. The armed men last night were not the plan. They were the impatience before the plan." Rosalind rode back to Wesley with her mind moving at a speed that made the horse feel slow. "I was waiting outside the general store with Decker's filled order loaded in the saddlebags, and he took one look at her face and said nothing, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him. His ability to read when words would wait. They rode out of town together, and she told him everything on the road. He listened without interrupting. This was another thing she valued. Wesley Hawthorne did not interrupt because he understood that the complete version of a thing was more useful than the partial version you got when you broke someone's concentration. When she finished, he was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Galt, we need him here, in person. Not a letter, not a deposition written from 40 miles away. Here in front of Calloway, where Alderman can't attack his credentials in absentia." "I'll send Cristobal today." "It needs to be today," she agreed. "Alderman will move fast once Voss releases those men and regroups." "There's another problem," Wesley said. He said it the way he said difficult things plainly, without softening, because he had never seen the use in making hard facts comfortable. "The east fence line. Voss's men cut 2 sections on their way in last night. The cattle in the north pasture are going to drift if we don't repair it before nightfall." "How many men does that take?" 4, maybe 5 to do it properly, which takes 4 or 5 men away from the valley when Voss is regrouping." "Yes." She thought about it for a moment. "Can we get it done before noon?" "If we start now." "Then we start now." She looked at him. Wesley, Cristobal needs to leave for Galtz before the fence crew goes out. I don't want the valley short of experienced men at the same time. He nodded once. You've thought about this like a military operation. My father used to say that a business problem and a military problem are the same problem with different uniforms. She paused. He also said he wished he'd understood that before it was too late. Wesley looked at her profile, the set jaw, the steady eyes, the particular quality of attention she brought to everything she turned it on. What happened to your father's business? He asked. It was the first time he had asked about her past in the direct way of someone who genuinely wanted the information rather than offering the question as conversation. He lost it, she said, to a man very much like Voss, slower, less organized, but the same essential creature, a person who believes that what other people build belongs to him if he can find a clever enough way to take it. She was quiet for a moment. My father didn't fight back. He was too tired and too alone, and he believed that the right thing and the legal thing were the same thing, and that the right thing would eventually prevail without him having to do much about it. And it didn't prevail. She looked at the road ahead. That's why I know how to fight this, because I watched someone not fight it, and I watched what happened. Wesley said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quietness of something said, with full and careful intention. I'm sorry, he said. About your father. She looked at him. He was looking at the road, but his jaw had the quality it had when he was feeling something he didn't have an easy word for. Thank you, she said. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of two people who have just handed each other something real and are giving each other time to hold it properly. Cristobal left for Henry Galt's location within the hour, riding light and fast, with a letter from Wesley and a verbal message from Rosalind that Cristobal received with the same focused attention he gave to everything she said. Attention she had noticed and appreciated since the first morning he'd called her Mrs. Hawthorne with his hat in his hands. The fence crew went out at the same time, 4 men with tools and timber moving efficiently through the valley's north edge, with the particular economy of people who have fixed many fences and know that the fastest way to do it right is to not do it twice. Rosalind spent the morning in the stone house with the maps and the correspondence she had begun, accumulating the letters to the land office. The letter from the land office that had arrived the previous day, acknowledging her request. The pencil-drawn map Wesley had made at the kitchen table 2 nights ago. She spread everything on the wide table in the main room and began building a timeline. She was 40 minutes into it when she heard the horse in the valley entrance. Not the fence crew, they had gone out the north side. Not Cristobal, he had ridden east. Single horse moving fast, and the ranch hand, who had been left at the entrance, was not stopping it, which meant it was someone he knew. She was at this door when Earl came through it. Earl, who had left for Prescott 2 days ago and should not have been back yet. How was covered in trail dust, and his horse was breathing hard, and his face had the look of a man who had ridden without adequate sleep for a considerable distance. Earl, she said. What happened? Judge Calloway, Earl said, and stopped to catch his breath. He was already on his way. She stared at him. What? He'd already been contacted. Earl dismounted stiffly. Before our letter got there, someone else wrote to him weeks ago. Anonymous. Detailed account of Voss's operations in this county, going back 4 years. The fence burning, the harassment. The competing land claims, the arrangement with Beaumont. He held her gaze. Calloway was already planning to come. Our letter just told him the situation had accelerated. Rosalind stood very still. When does he arrive? She said. How is a day behind me? Earl said. He's moving with a deputy marshal and 2 court officers. He paused. He'll be in Black Hollow tomorrow morning. She turned and went back inside to the table with the maps and the timeline. Tomorrow morning. She thought about who had written to Calloway weeks ago, detailed anonymous covering 4 years of Voss's operations. Not Decker, who had only found his nerve last night. Not Earl or Cristobal, who were Wesley's men and whose accounts would be dismissed as interested. Not Margaret Voss, who had been sitting in her white shuttered house accumulating shame, but not yet action. Someone else. Someone who had been watching Voss for 4 years and building a record and waiting for the right moment to use it. She was still turning that question over when Wesley came in from the fence line at midday, and she told him about Calloway, and she watched his face go through the same recalibration hers had gone through surprise assessment. And then the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the landscape around him has shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated. "Someone's been building a case," he said. "For years," she said. "Before I came. Before you sent for me. Someone in Voss's world has been documenting everything and waiting." Wesley sat down at the table and looked at the timeline she had built. He looked at it for a long time. "Margaret," he said. Rosalind looked at him sharply. She said she had no money, no independence. She said she had no money and that the house belonged to Garrett. He looked up. She didn't say she had no pen and paper. He paused. Her husband Garrett's brother died 3 years ago. Before that, she had access to everything. She knew the business. She knew the operations. He held Rosalind's gaze. A woman who has been living in a house that belongs to a man she despises, watching him destroy people for years with no power to act openly, she would document things. She would keep records, because records are the only power available to a person who has no other kind. Rosalind thought about Margaret Voss's face when she opened the door that morning. The shame, the complicated privacy of her expression. Not the shame of a person who had done nothing. The shame of a person who had done the only thing she could slowly and in secret, and was not sure it had been enough and had not yet found out. "I need to go back to her," Rosalind said. "Yes," Wesley said, "but not alone this time." He stood up. She looked at him. "I'll come with you," he said. "It's past time Margaret Voss had a conversation with me directly instead of around the edges." They rode back into Black Hollow in the early afternoon, and this time the silence on the street was different again. It had a watchfulness to it. The specific attention of a community that has sensed something shifting and is trying to determine which direction the shift is going. Rosalind knocked on the white shuttered door, and Margaret opened it and saw both of them this time, and what moved across her face was something rawer and more complicated than it had been that morning. "You know," she said. Not a question. "We know someone wrote to Calloway," Rosalind said. "We know it wasn't recent." Margaret stepped back from the door. They went in. The parlor was the same cold fireplace and careful quiet. But Margaret moved to the small writing desk in the corner and opened the top drawer and took out a flat packet of folded papers tied with string and set it on the table between them without ceremony. 3 years and 4 months, she said. Every incident I could document. Dates, descriptions, names of men involved, amounts paid, property affected. She looked at Wesley directly for the first time, and her voice was steady. "Your father was a decent man, Mr. Hawthorne. He was kind to my husband in a time when Garrett was not. I wasn't able to stop what Garrett was doing to your land, but I could make sure there was a record of it." Wesley looked at the packet on the table. He looked at it for a long moment. "Margaret," he said. His voice was the quiet, careful voice he used when he was saying something that mattered to him. "Why didn't you send this to Calloway sooner?" "Because sooner there was no one to send it to who could make it matter," she said. "Calloway is honest, but he's also careful. He won't move on testimony from one anonymous source with no corroboration. He needed other voices." She paused. "And then your wife walked into town." Rosalind looked at her. "You went to Beaumont in the middle of the night," Margaret said. "Alone, in front of witnesses. You made it impossible to pretend away." A pause. "And Decker finally said something out loud. And Earl rode to Prescott." She looked down at the packet. "You created the corroboration. So I sent the letter that told Calloway to come now. It was Decker who brought the news at 4 in the afternoon, coming into the valley on horseback, with the particular urgency of a man who has decided that if he is going to be useful, he might as well be entirely useful. He found them in the stone house, and he reported what he knew in the straightforward manner of a man who had dispensed with equivocation. Beaumont had released Voss's 4 men 2 hours ago. Voss's lawyer Alderman had arrived in Black Hollow on the afternoon stage, and Voss himself had gone to the land office and filed an emergency competing claim on 3 sections of the Hawthorne property, citing procedural irregularities in the original survey dated and witnessed and submitted before the office closed for the day. The legal attack had begun. Rosalind looked at the packet of Margaret Voss's documents on the table. She looked at Wesley. She looked at Earl, who had come in behind Decker and was listening with the patient attention of a man who had seen many difficult things and expected to see a few more. "Calloway arrives tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes," Decker said. "Which means Alderman filed tonight because he knows Calloway is coming, and he wants the competing claim on record before Calloway gets here." She stood up. "He filed 3 sections." "Which 3?" Decker told her. She went to the map on the table and found them immediately. She put her finger on the first. "The South Spring Creek section." She moved to the second. "The East Mineral Deposit boundary." The third. "The Valley Entrance Corridor." She looked up at Wesley. "He's not trying to take the whole property," she said. "He's trying to cut it apart. The water, the minerals, the access." She felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, not anger, but the cold and useful clarity of a problem fully seen. "Without those 3 sections, the rest of the land is still yours on paper and worthless in practice." "Can we counterfile before Calloway arrives?" Wesley asked. "Not tonight. The land office is closed." She straightened. "But we can be at Calloway's door the moment he arrives tomorrow morning, with Margaret's documentation, with Galt's deposition if Cristobal rides hard enough." She looked at Wesley. "And with every person in this county who is willing to stand up and say what they've seen." She looked at Decker. "How many people in Black Hollow have been directly hurt by Voss's operations in the past 6 years?" Decker thought about it seriously, in the way she had learned he thought about serious things. "8 families I can name without thinking hard," he said. "Probably a dozen if I make a list." "Make the list," she said. "Tonight. And tomorrow morning, I need those families to be willing to speak to Calloway's people before Alderman gets his version into the record first." She held Decker's gaze. "Can you do that?" He put his hat on. "Yes," he said. "I believe I can." After Decker left, Wesley stood at the window of the stone house his father had started and looked out at the valley going dark in the early evening, the cattle shapes in the north pasture, the streams catching the last light. He was very still in the particular way he was still when he was carrying something heavy and deciding how to distribute the weight. Rosalind came to stand beside him. "This is going to work," she said. "You don't know that," he said. "Not a challenge, just precision." "No," she agreed. "But I know we've done everything that can be done with what we have, and tomorrow we'll do everything that can be done with what arrives." She paused. "Your father built this valley alone. You held it alone for 6 years. You don't have to hold it alone anymore." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the unhurried patience of wind that has been moving through this particular place for a very long time. "Rosalind," he said. "Yes. When all of this is finished..." He stopped. He looked at his hands. She had come to understand a man who chose his words so carefully that sometimes the choosing took visible effort. "I want to show you the valley properly, not in a crisis, not before dawn on the way to something urgent." He looked at her. "I want to show you what my father built and what I finished, and I want you to see it the way it's meant to be seen." She looked at his face in the fading light, the jaw, the steady eyes, the expression that was not quite hope, but was the thing that lived directly next to it. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once. And somewhere in town, in Garrett Voss's office above the bank, a lawyer named Alderman was explaining in his careful, methodical voice why the Hawthorne claim was vulnerable and what the next 12 hours needed to look like. Voss listened with his hands flat on the desk and his pleasant face arranged into the expression he used when he was being patient. He was not in fact patient. He was calculating, because the woman had surprised him twice now, and a man who allowed himself to be surprised 3 times by the same person deserved what came next. He was not going to allow a 3rd time. Judge Calloway arrived at 7 in the morning, not at the hotel, not at the sheriff's office, not at any of the places a man of his position might reasonably be expected to establish himself upon arriving in a new town. He arrived at the land office, which was not yet open, and he knocked on the door of the clerk who lived in the rooms above it, until that clerk came down in his nightshirt with a lamp and let him in. Because when a federal circuit judge knocked on your door before sunrise, there was only one reasonable response. Rosalind was there when he arrived. She had ridden in from the valley at 5 in the morning with Earl beside her and Margaret's packet of documents under her arm, and she had waited on the wooden sidewalk outside the land office in the cold, with the patience of a woman who had decided that the first person through that door was going to determine whose version of events became the working version, and she had decided that person was going to be her. Calloway was a lean man in his 60s, with a precise white beard and the kind of eyes that had spent several decades listening to people tell him things that weren't true and had developed as a result a particular quality of attention. The attention of someone who was measuring not just what you said, but the distance between what you said and what your face did while you were saying it. He looked at Rosalind standing on the sidewalk at 7:05, with a packet of documents under her arm, and a composure that the early hour and the cold had not visibly diminished, and he said, "Mrs. Hawthorne, I presume." "Judge Calloway." She extended her hand and he shook it. "Thank you for coming quickly. Your husband's letter suggested urgency was appropriate." He looked at the land office door now standing open with a lamp burning inside. "Shall we?" They went in. She had 40 minutes before Alderman arrived, and she used every one of them. She laid Margaret's documentation on the clerk's counter and walked Calloway through it in the methodical sequence she had organized the night before. The oldest incidents first building the pattern before presenting the recent events, because a judge understood patterns better than isolated incidents, and because Alderman's strategy would be to make each event look isolated and therefore minor. She did not editorialize. She did not appeal to emotion. She presented the documentation the way a person presents evidence, when they are confident the evidence is sufficient without decoration. Calloway read. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, none of them the questions of a man who needed to be convinced of the framework, only the questions of a man filling in specific gaps. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the documents spread on the counter and said, "The original surveyor, Galt. Where is he?" "On his way," she said. "I expect him before noon." Calloway looked at her steadily. "You expect him. I sent my husband's most reliable man to collect him 2 days ago. Cristobal has never failed to accomplish what he was sent to accomplish." She held Calloway's gaze. "If you need time before the formal hearing to review Galt's deposition, I can arrange for him to meet with you privately first." Calloway almost smiled. "You've organized this like a trial, Mrs. Hawthorne. I organized it like a problem that needed solving before the other side got their version into the record," she said. "The formal structure is yours to provide." He did smile, then briefly contained the smile of a man who appreciated precision. "Alderman is very good," he said. "I've seen his work in 3 counties. He finds the seam in a filing, and he pulls it until the whole thing comes apart." "I know his method," she said. "Margaret Voss explained it to me 2 days ago." Calloway looked at the packet of documents. "Margaret Voss provided these?" "Yes." "Garrett Voss's sister-in-law?" "Yes." A pause. "Is she willing to testify formally?" "She is." Rosalind paused. "She has been building this record for 3 years. She would like the opportunity to make it matter." Calloway folded his hands on the counter and looked at Rosalind for a long moment with those measuring eyes. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "how long have you been in Black Hollow?" 5 weeks, she said. He looked at the counter full of organized documentation, the witness list Decker had produced the night before the 3-year record. Margaret had maintained the survey correspondence, the land office filing timeline she had reconstructed by hand. 5 weeks, he said again. Not a question this time, just the particular repetition of a man revising his understanding of a situation. The door opened. Alderman came in at 7:48, and he was good. She had to grant him that immediately. He walked in without hurry, assessed the room in a single sweep, registered Calloway and Rosalind, and the documents on the counter, and produced a smile that was professionally calibrated to convey confidence without aggression. He was perhaps 50 well-dressed, with the particular bearing of a man who had won enough legal arguments to have made winning his default expectation. "Judge Calloway," he said with a nod that was respectful without being deferential. Then he looked at Rosalind. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I was hoping to speak with the judge privately this morning as opposing counsel." "Mrs. Hawthorne is not opposing counsel," Calloway said. "She's a property owner making a prior filing against a claim submitted by your client last night." He looked at Alderman steadily. "And she's been here since before 7, which means I have already heard her presentation. You'll have your turn when the formal hearing opens." He paused. "Which I'm scheduling for 2 o'clock this afternoon. My courtroom will be the town hall since there is no courthouse." Alderman's professional composure did not change, but something shifted underneath it. A recalibration, the same one. Rosalind had watched on Beaumont's face, on Decker's face, on every face that had arrived expecting one set of conditions and found another. "Judge," he said carefully, "my client filed a legitimate competing claim based on documented procedural." "I've seen the claim," Calloway said. "I've also seen what Mrs. Hawthorne has put on this counter this morning. We'll address both at 2 o'clock. He stood up. "Good morning, Mr. Alderman." Alderman left. Rosalind let out a breath she had not been entirely aware of holding. "Thank you," she said to Calloway. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "He's good, and he had all night to prepare. Make sure Galt is here by 1. She was already at the door. Wesley was outside with the horses, and he had brought Decker, and Decker had brought 3 of the families from his list people. Rosalind hadn't met yet, a husband and wife who had lost a water claim 2 years ago to Voss's competing filing a rancher who had sold under pressure when Voss's men damaged his barn 3 times in a month, and an older woman named Sadie Pruitt who had lived in Black Hollow for 30 years and had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of morning for most of them. Rosalind looked at all of them standing on the sidewalk in the early morning cold and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, nothing so simple, but a specific kind of recognition. These were people who had been sitting with their losses in private, each one believing themselves to be alone in it. And now they were standing on the same sidewalk and beginning to understand that the aloneness had been a construction. Voss's most effective tool had never been the money or the lawyers or the men on horses in the night. It had been the isolation, making each person believe that no one else was standing where they were standing. "All right," she said to all of them. "Here's what we need to do before 2 o'clock. She spent the next 3 hours doing 5 things simultaneously, in the way that only a person who has been managing complex problems alone for a long time is capable of. She sent Earl back to the valley entrance to watch for Cristobal, gave Wesley the witness list with specific instructions about which person needed to speak to Calloway's deputy marshal first, and why worked with Decker to get Sadie Pruitt's 30 years of first-hand observation organized into a coherent sequence, and sat with the rancher and the husband and wife, and helped them understand the difference between what they had experienced and what was useful for a formal hearing, as opposed to what was useful for private grievance. At 11:47, Cristobal rode into Black Hollow. He was not alone. Henry Galt was with him, a man of perhaps 70, compact and white-haired, with the precise movements of someone who had spent a professional lifetime measuring things and understood the importance of getting measurements right. He dismounted with the stiffness of a man who had ridden hard and long and was not 20 years old, but had done it anyway because the thing he had been asked to come for was worth the cost. He looked at Rosalind when Cristobal introduced them and said without preamble, "Wesley's father was the finest man I worked with in 40 years of surveying. Whatever that land needs from me, I'm here to provide it." She looked at this man who had ridden 2 days because Wesley's father had been decent to him, and she thought about all the ways decency accumulated over time, slowly, quietly, without fanfare, and then all at once, in a moment, when it mattered enormously. "Come inside," she said. "We have 2 hours, and I need you to understand everything before we walk into that town hall." At 1:30, Garrett Voss himself appeared on the street. She saw him from the window of the room where they had been preparing, and she watched him cross toward the town hall with aldermen beside him and 2 other men behind. And she noticed that his posture was precisely the same as it had always been, the unhurried walk, the clean hat, the practiced pleasantness. He was performing confidence. She had learned in 5 weeks of watching him to distinguish his real stillness from his performed stillness, and this was performed. Howe was not comfortable. He glanced toward the window she was standing at, and for a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and neither of them looked away first. Then he turned and went into the town hall, and she turned back to the room and said, "It's time." The town hall of Black Hollow held perhaps 60 people if they were willing to stand close together. By 1:55 it held close to 80, because word had moved through the town the way word moved through small communities, rapidly, incompletely, and with enough distortion that people came to find out what was actually happening. What they found was Judge Calloway at the front table, with his deputy marshal and court officer alderman on one side, with Voss and his 2 men, and Wesley and Rosalind on the other side, with Galt Earl, Christabel Decker, Margaret Voss, and the 3 families from Decker's list. The room looked at these 2 sides and made its calculation. Calloway opened at exactly 2 o'clock, because he was the kind of man who opened at exactly when he said he would. Alderman went first. How was his advertised? Very good. He presented Voss's competing claim in language that was reasonable and measured, acknowledging the Hawthorne family's long tenure on the land, while arguing with careful precision that the original survey conducted by Henry Galt in 1861 contained a dating irregularity in the witness signature block that rendered the claim's priority status technically challengeable under territorial filing law. He cited 3 precedents. He spoke for 22 minutes without notes. The room was quiet, while he spoke the specific quiet of people who are listening to something that sounds reasonable and are trying to determine why it feels wrong. When he finished, Calloway looked at Rosalind. She stood up. She had decided the night before how she was going to do this, not as a lawyer, because she wasn't one, and not as a supplicant, because she wasn't that either. She was going to do it as a person who had organized information carefully and was going to present it clearly, because clarity was the thing Alderman was specifically trying to prevent. "Judge Calloway," she said, "the dating irregularity Mr. Alderman referenced appears in the witness signature block of the original filing, because the witness Henry Galt signed the document in a different county than where the survey was conducted 2 days after the survey was completed. This is documented in Mr. Galt's personal survey log, which he has here." She nodded to Galt, who set a worn leather-bound log on the table. "The territorial filing law," Mr. Alderman cited, "requires that the witness signature be contemporaneous with the filing, not with the survey. The filing was made 6 days after the survey, and Mr. Galt's signature was obtained 4 days after the survey and 2 days before the filing. It is not only compliant, it is precisely compliant." Alderman's professional composure did not break, but it moved. A fraction. "Furthermore," she continued, "the 3 precedents Mr. Alderman cited all involve cases where the original survey was conducted by a surveyor operating outside his licensed territory. Mr. Galt's license at the time of the 1861 survey covered the full Black Hollow territory, as documented in the territorial licensing records, copies of which are in this packet." She set Margaret's organized documentation on Calloway's table. "Those same records show that Mr. Voss's agent filed a request to review Mr. Galt's licensing history with the territorial office 3 months ago. The request was denied because the licensing records are complete and unambiguous. The fact that Mr. Voss investigated this avenue and found it closed does not make the avenue open again by asserting it in a formal hearing." The room was still very quiet. Calloway was reading. His deputy marshal was reading. Alderman was looking at his hands with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the seam he was planning to pull was sewn shut from the other side. Rosalind sat down. Wesley looked at her. She looked at him. He said nothing. But the look said everything it needed to say. Gold testified for 40 minutes precisely, and without embellishment, in the voice of a man who has measured things carefully for 50 years, and has no interest in saying anything that wasn't true. He walked Calloway through the original survey methodology, the licensing documentation, the filing sequence, and the physical geography of the valley, in enough technical detail that Alderman's attempt to cross-examine him on the procedural irregularity became visibly a conversation that Alderman was losing. Then Margaret Voss stood up. She stood up without being called. She simply stood, and the room looked at her, and Garrett Voss looked at her from across the room with an expression that went through several things very quickly. Surprise, assessment, and then something cold and flat, that she met with a steadiness Rosalind recognized. The steadiness of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has finally decided that the fear costs more than the thing it was protecting. "Judge Calloway," Margaret said. "My name is Margaret Voss. I am the widow of Thomas Voss, Garrett Voss's younger brother. I have a formal statement I would like to submit to this proceeding." Calloway looked at her. "Mrs. Voss, are you represented by counsel?" "No." She lifted her chin slightly. "I am representing myself as a witness to events I have documented over the past 3 years and 4 months." Alderman was on his feet. "Judge, this witness was not disclosed." "She's not a witness for the Hawthornes," Calloway said without looking at Alderman. "She's a witness who has presented herself voluntarily to the court." He looked at Margaret. "Please proceed, Mrs. Voss." Margaret read her statement in a clear, even voice that did not shake. She read it the way it had been written, methodically, with dates and descriptions, and the names of people who had been present, the same discipline of a woman who had understood from the beginning that emotion without documentation was dismissible, and documentation without emotion was merely paperwork. She made it both. Garrett Voss sat across the room and listened to his sister-in-law dismantle the careful architecture of his operations, with 3 years of her patient private record-keeping, and his face did something that Rosalind had never seen it do before. It went still. Not the performed stillness, the real kind. The stillness of a man who has just understood that the thing he believed was safe was never safe at all, and that the person he had been most certain of, the quiet widow in the white-shuttered house, who laughed at his jokes and accepted his charity, had been the most dangerous person in his orbit the entire time. When Margaret finished, the room was absolutely quiet. Then Sadie Pruitt stood up without being asked. She was a small, solid woman of perhaps 65, with white hair, and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting 30 years for an appropriate venue. "I'd like to add something," she said to Calloway, with the directness of a person who had not arrived to be shy about it. Calloway looked at her with something that was almost warmth. "Go ahead, ma'am." Sadie talked for 12 minutes. She talked about what Black Hollow had looked like before Garrett Voss's family consolidated their land holdings. She talked about the families who had left. She talked about the businesses that had closed. She talked about the specific texture of a community that had spent a decade being slowly compressed by one man's hunger. And she talked about it with the authority of someone who had lived in the middle of it and kept her eyes open the whole time. When she finished, she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Calloway with the expression of a woman who has said what she came to say. Voss's lawyer leaned toward him and said something quickly and quietly. Voss shook his head. Alderman leaned in again. Voss said something back equally quiet, and Alderman sat back in his chair with the controlled expression of a lawyer who has received an instruction he doesn't agree with, but is professionally obligated to follow. Calloway looked at the room over his reading spectacles. "Mr. Alderman, does your client wish to respond to any of the testimony just given?" Alderman stood. "Judge Calloway, my client acknowledges that the documentation presented by the Hawthorne party establishes the procedural validity of the original claim with sufficient clarity that the competing filing submitted last evening cannot be sustained on the grounds originally cited." He paused. "My client requests that the competing filing be withdrawn without prejudice." The room absorbed that. Without prejudice, meaning Voss reserved the right to try again. Calloway looked at Rosalind. She stood up. "Judge Calloway, we would ask that the withdrawal be entered with prejudice on the specific grounds cited in the competing filing, given that those grounds have been demonstrated to be factually without basis, and that the same grounds have been investigated by Mr. Voss's agent 3 months prior with the same result." She paused. "We would also ask the court to formally note for the territorial record the documented pattern of harassment and physical intimidation described in the testimony today, and to issue a standing order prohibiting further interference with the Hawthorne property or its occupants." Alderman started to stand. "Sit down, Mr. Alderman," Calloway said without looking at him. He was looking at Rosalind. "Motion granted on both points. I'll have the formal order prepared by end of day." He looked across the room at Garrett Voss. "Mr. Voss, the territorial record now contains 3 years of documented conduct, sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, and a formal harassment order." I would encourage you to consider very carefully what the next chapter of your professional life in this county looks like." Voss said nothing. He stood up, buttoned his coat, and walked out of the town hall with Alderman beside him and his 2 men behind, and the room watched him go with the specific sober attention of a community that has just watched the scaffolding of something come apart. After he left, no one spoke for a moment. Then Sadie Pruitt said to no one in particular, "Well, it's about time." And the room exhaled. Wesley was beside Rosalind before she fully realized he had moved. He was not a man who made physical gestures of emotion easily or publicly, and she had learned not to expect them. So when she felt his hand close around hers firmly, completely, without hesitation, she understood the full weight of what the gesture cost a man like him to make in a room full of people. She closed her hand around his. They stood like that in the middle of the Black Hollow Town Hall, while the room moved around them, and Decker congratulated Galt and Sadie Pruitt, told Calloway's deputy marshal exactly what she thought about the sheriff's arrangement with Voss, and Margaret Voss sat in her chair near the front, with the expression of a woman who has just put down something extremely heavy and is not yet sure what to do with her empty hands. Rosalind crossed the room to her. She sat down in the empty chair beside Margaret, and they sat together for a moment in the noise and movement of the room around them. "You've been carrying that record for 3 years," Rosalind said. Margaret looked at the front table where Calloway was writing. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, she said. "I know because I wrote the date on the first page." "What made you start?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Thomas, my husband, died believing he could have stopped Garrett if he'd been stronger. He died with that." She paused. "I decided someone in this family was going to make it right. And since I was the only one left, that was going to be me." Rosalind looked at this woman who had lived in a house that belonged to her enemy for 3 years, keeping records in private, building a case no one knew she was building, waiting for the conditions that would make it matter. "Where will you go?" Rosalind asked. "After this." Margaret looked at her with an expression that was just beginning slowly to allow itself to consider possibility. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "It's been a long time since I've had to think about what I wanted rather than what was permissible." "That's a good problem to have," Rosalind said. "Yes." Margaret looked at her. "I think it is." The formal order came through at 4 o'clock exactly as Calloway promised, because he was exactly the kind of man who delivered what he promised when he promised it. The competing filing was withdrawn with prejudice. The harassment order was entered into the territorial record, with a certified copy sent to the Attorney General's office in Phoenix, which Calloway added without being asked, in the way of a man who understood that documentation needed distribution to be effective. Beaumont read the order in his office with his deputy watching and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "Should have done something sooner." His deputy said nothing. There was nothing to say. Alderman left on the evening stage. He did not speak to anyone on his way out, which was the most honest communication he had made all day. Garrett Voss did not leave. This was the thing that didn't settle right. Rosalind noticed it as they were riding back through town toward the valley. Voss's horse was still at the rail outside his office, and his window was lit, and the silhouette of a man standing at the window, watching the street, was visible against the light. She said nothing, but she noticed. Wesley noticed that she noticed. "He won't move openly again," he said. "Not with Calloway's order in the territorial record." "No," she agreed. "Not openly." "Rosalind, I know." She looked at the road ahead. "I'm not afraid of him, Wesley. I just haven't stopped thinking yet." He looked at her profile in the evening dark. "What are you thinking about?" "The receivership option," she said. "The one Voss never got to use. If he finds another angle, a tax irregularity, a water rights dispute filed in a different jurisdiction. Anything that creates a pretext for a receivership petition. Calloway's harassment order doesn't cover it. It's a different legal mechanism. You think he's patient enough to find it? I think he's been patient for 6 years, and this morning was humiliating, and humiliated patient men are the most dangerous kind." She paused. "We need our documentation filed in Phoenix, not copies. Originals registered with the Attorney General's office directly. Once it's there, Any challenge to the Hawthorne claim has to go through the territorial level, which takes it entirely out of Beaumont's jurisdiction and out of any local Judge Voss might be able to reach. Wesley was quiet for a moment. That requires a trip to Phoenix. Yes. That's 3 days each way. I know. She looked at him. Can Earl make it? Earl can make anything, Wesley said. But this is too important for Earl alone. He paused. I'll go. She looked at him. I'll go with you. He started to say something. Wesley. Her voice was level and final. I am not staying behind while you carry 6 years of your family's documentation to the Attorney General's office alone. If something happens on that road, I need to be there. She held his gaze. I am not a person who waits while the important things happen without her. You know that about me by now. He looked at her for a long moment with the private expression, the one that had started as rare and was becoming gradually more frequent. Yes, he said. I know that about you. They left for Phoenix 3 days later with the originals sealed in a leather case, and Earl riding 2 hours ahead of them as a scout, and Cristobal in command of the valley in their absence, with specific and detailed instructions from Rosalind, that Cristobal received with the expression of a man who was starting to find the thoroughness familiar, and had decided he approved of it. The road to Phoenix was long and cold, and occasionally beautiful in the particular way of desert country that does not try to be beautiful, and is therefore more so. They rode through it mostly in comfortable silence, the kind that belongs to two people who have stopped needing to fill space with words, because the space itself has become a kind of conversation. On the second night, camped by a creek that caught the firelight and threw it in pieces. Wesley said, Tell me about the life you had before Black Hollow, the actual one, not what you told me when you needed me to trust you. She looked at him across the fire. You knew I was editing. I knew you were giving me what I needed to hear to make a decision. He looked at the fire. I'd like to know the rest, so she told him. Not the summary she had given him, the father's failed business, the boarding house, the letter, but the actual version. The years before that, the childhood in a house where she had been loved, and then the years after her mother died, where love had been replaced by the specific arithmetic of an overwhelmed father who managed her the way he managed his accounts competently but without warmth. The years of learning to be capable, because capability was the only thing that reliably produced value in other people's eyes. The series of rooms in other people's houses. The series of jobs that used everything she had and rewarded as little of it as they could manage. The accumulated weight of being looked at and found wanting by people who had not looked very hard or very long. Wesley listened, the way he listened to everything completely without interruption, with the full and patient attention of a man who understood that what he was being given was real and treated it accordingly. When she finished, the fire had burned down, and the creak was the loudest thing. Rosalind, he said. Yes. I want to tell you something. He was looking at the fire. When I wrote the advertisement for a wife before I sent it, I wrote it 4 times. The first 3 versions talked about the ranch, the land, the opportunity. He paused. I threw them all out, because I realized I was describing what I had, and what I needed was someone who was interested in who I was. He looked up from the fire and at her directly. I didn't know if that person existed. I thought maybe I was asking for something that wasn't available. A pause. I was wrong about that. She looked at her husband across the dying fire on the road to Phoenix, this man who had hidden an empire behind a cracked boot disguise and swept his floors in secret and placed his hand at the small of her back in a room full of mocking strangers, and she thought, I came here believing I was out of options. I was wrong about that too. Wesley, she said. Yes, when we get back from Phoenix. She held his gaze. I'd like to see the valley the way you promised. Not in a crisis. Not before dawn. He looked at her for a long moment, and the thing that lived next to hope in his face settled into something warmer and more certain than hope. Yes, ma'am, he said. They filed the documents in Phoenix on the 5th day in the office of a territorial attorney general's clerk, who took the leather case with routine efficiency and stamped the registration with a seal and a date, and handed Rosalind the receipt, and she held that receipt in her hands for a moment, and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a door closing on something that could no longer get back through it. Earl was waiting outside with the horses. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded. Once the Earl nod, that meant everything it needed to mean, and they started back. 3 weeks after they returned to Black Hollow, Garrett Voss left the county. He did not announce his departure. He did not sell his holdings. Those would take months to unwind through lawyers, and the process would leave tracks in the territorial record that he apparently did not want to create quickly. He simply was not there one morning when the town woke up, and his office above the bank was locked, and his horse was gone from the stable. Black Hollow noticed his absence. The way a room notices when something that has been pressing on its walls is removed. A gradual, uncertain expanding, the slow recovery of a space that has been compressed for a long time and is not yet sure how large it's allowed to be. Decker opened his store that morning, and someone made a joke at the counter, and everyone laughed in the specific way people laugh when they haven't laughed freely in a while and have forgotten how good it feels. Sadie Pruitt walked down the middle of Main Street for the first time in years. She had always kept to the sidewalk. When Voss was in town, she told Rosalind later, because walking in the middle of the street was something she associated with people who believed they had a right to be somewhere, and she had stopped believing that for a long time. Beaumont resigned his position as sheriff 6 days after Voss left. He left a brief written statement with Calloway's deputy marshal, acknowledging the arrangement with Voss and his failure to act on the harassment complaints made over 6 years, and recommending that the territorial authority appoint a replacement from outside the county. It was the most honest document he had produced in 11 years of office. The county elected a new sheriff 3 months later. It was the rancher from Decker's list, the one who had sold his east pasture under pressure 2 years ago. His name was Jim Calhoun, and he was straightforward and hard to intimidate, and he had personally experienced what happened when a sheriff was neither of those things. Margaret Voss did not leave Black Hollow. Rosalind had half expected her to take the freedom her testimony had earned her and go somewhere entirely new. Somewhere that didn't contain the house with the white shutters and the 30 years of compromised silence. But Margaret did not leave. She stayed in the house which she began quietly reclaiming as her own, once Garrett's lawyers established that his withdrawal from the county made continued ownership of the property legally complicated in ways that ultimately resolved in her favor. She replanted the garden that had been there before Thomas died, and that she had let go to dry ground in the years of being afraid. She started attending the community meetings that Rosalind had begun organizing, and she became over time the kind of person in a community who other people brought their harder problems to because she had demonstrated the capacity to hold difficult things without dropping them. Rosalind began the school in the valley at the start of the following spring. It began with 4 children, the families of 2 ranch hands who had been driving their children 40 miles each way for schooling when they could manage it. By fall, it had 11 children. By the following year, it had 19, and Rosalind had recruited a young woman from Prescott named Clara Whitfield, who had a teaching certificate and no current position, and who arrived in the valley with 1 trunk and 1 carpet bag, and a clear-eyed assessment of the situation that reminded Rosalind with a private and specific warmth of herself. The food organization. The coordination of supply and distribution across the struggling families in the surrounding territory began as a practical response to 2 bad months, when 3 families lost cattle and had inadequate winter stores, and grew into something more intentional. Rosalind organized it with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, and she brought Wesley into it, not by asking him to help, but by showing him what was needed and letting him decide, because she had learned that this was the way Wesley Hawthorne made commitments, by being shown the shape of the thing clearly and given room to arrive at it himself. He arrived at it himself. He always did. On the first morning of June, 6 months after the hearing in the town hall, Wesley woke Rosalind before dawn and said, "Come on." She dressed and followed him into the valley's morning, and he showed her what he had promised to show her, the valley, not in crisis, not before dawn, but in the full warm light of a June morning, moving through it slowly, naming things she had known by function and now learned by story. He showed her the spring his father had found, first kneeling in the dry scrubland with his ear to the ground like a man listening to the land confess something. He showed her the foundation stones of the first structure his father had built. Not the house, but a small shelter, 4 walls and a roof, because the first thing a man building something real builds is somewhere to sleep while he does it. He showed her where the cattle had been when he came back from his father's burial, thin and nervous, penned in too tight, and how he had spent the first week not grieving but working, because the cattle needed him, and work was the only language grief spoke that he knew how to answer. He showed her where he wanted to build the next barn, and the section of the East Ridge, where he had found on his own survey 2 years ago, a vein of ore that ran deeper than his father's original assessment had reached. He told her what he thought it was worth, and what he planned to do with it, and how he had been waiting until the land was secure before he did anything about it, because developing the mineral claim would make the property's value undeniable, and undeniable value was exactly what Voss had needed to justify his efforts. And now, she asked. Now it doesn't matter who knows, he said. Let them know. She stood in the June morning in the valley with the grass thick under their boots, and the streams doing what they had always done, and the stone house at the center of it, solid and permanent and finished. And she thought about the woman who had stood on the porch in her nightgown in the gray dawn, and thrown a chamber pot into the yard, and said, "This is not my life." She had been right. It hadn't been her life. This was her life. This valley, this man, this community of people who had learned to stop being afraid, and were finding out slowly and imperfectly, and with the difficulty that always accompanies freedom after a long constriction, what they wanted to be instead. Wesley stood beside her in the morning light and looked at the same valley she was looking at. "Rosalind," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something." She looked at him. I was looking at the valley, and then he turned and looked at her directly, fully, with the complete and private attention he reserved for things he considered worth trusting completely. "Are you glad you stayed?" he said. She looked at her husband. She looked at the valley his father had found, and he had built, and they had fought for together and won. She thought about the boarding house room and the cracked plaster and the letter on the floor and the train west and the broken fences and the cracked boots and every moment between then and this one. "Wesley," she said, "I am not glad I stayed." He went still. "I am glad I came," she said. "There is a difference. Staying is what you do when you've given up looking for something better. Coming is what you do when you believe something better is possible." She held his gaze. "I came here believing you, and you were worth believing." The thing that happened to Wesley Hawthorne's face in that moment was not the almost smile she had come to know. It was something older and quieter and more complete than that. It was the face of a man who has been alone in something enormous for a very long time and has finally fully been found. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the town hall, firmly, completely, without hesitation. And Rosalind Hawthorne stood in the valley that was hers, as much as it had ever been anyone's, in the life she had chosen, with the man she had chosen in the territory that now bore the record of what they had built and fought for, and refused to surrender. And she understood with the clean and certain knowledge of a woman who has finally arrived somewhere worth arriving, that the greatest thing she had ever done was not be patient. It was decide. She had decided to write back. She had decided to stay when others expected her to break. She had decided to ask the questions no one else was asking. She had decided to walk into the sheriff's office in the middle of the night and make herself impossible to ignore. She had decided every single day to be the person she had always been capable of being in a life that was finally large enough to hold her. And that when people in Black Hollow told the story years later, and they told it often because it was the story that marked the line between the town they had been and the town they became, was the part they always came back to. Not the hearing, not the documents, not Voss's departure, or Beaumont's resignation, or the mineral claim, or the school, or the food stores, or any of the practical architecture of a life well built. What they came back to was the woman who arrived with one trunk and one carpet bag and a heart that had been judged and found wanting by people who had not looked hard enough or long enough, and who had looked back at all of it. The cracked boots, the broken fences, the mocking eyes on the sidewalk, the men on horses in the yard, the flames on the ridge, and the lawyer's careful arguments, and the patience of a powerful man who believed patience was the same as winning, and had decided without apology and without hesitation that none of it was sufficient reason to be less than exactly who she was. Rosalind Mercer had arrived in Black Hollow, believing she was marrying a poor farmer. She had found instead a man who had been waiting for someone worth trusting with everything he had. And he had found in the woman everyone underestimated, the only partner equal to the life he had built in secret, and the life they would build together in full and open light for every year that followed. That was not a story about land or cattle, or a hidden valley, or a legal battle, won in a small town hall on a cold afternoon in 1882. It was a story about what happens when a woman who has been told her entire life that she is not enough walks into the right life at the right moment and discovers with the certainty of someone who has finally stopped taking other people's measurements as authoritative that she has always been exactly enough. She had always been exactly that, and now at last the world around